is Michelle at Jasami Bookworm Podcast. Once again, I have one of my favorite people that I love to interview. I'd like to welcome Judith Bowers from the Britannia Panopticon. Welcome, Judith.
Hello, Michelle.
We have something a little different for today's audience. Today is the 2nd of November, 2023. And on the 2nd of November, 2024, what's going to happen?
We're going to be releasing my new book, the first book of a trilogy, in fact. And it's called The Magic Lantern.
I love magic. This is wonderful. So you're going to treat everybody by reading the first chapter today?
First chapter today, and then we're going to be reading another chapter on the first Thursday of December and another chapter on the first Thursday of January. In fact, we're going to be reading one chapter for the next 12 months on the first Thursday of every month until it's released on the 2nd of November 2024.
So now you know the first thing you're going to have on your schedule to do the first Thursday of every month for the next 12 months. So I'm not going to blather on. I am going to let you hear directly from the author, The Magic Lantern.
And this is Chapter 1, Tam. It was the longest, darkest night of the year, and much of the city had already closed doors, lit lamps and stoked up fires to fend off the bleakness. Only a few brave souls were out wandering the streets, wind-driven, icy sleet whipping their faces, the biting cold penetrating their clothes. One of these brave souls, battling the elements in his third-hand woolen coat, was 17-year-old Tam Murray, and although he didn't know it at that moment, tonight would be the most significant night of his life, for tonight he would die. A fresh blast of bitter winter wind brought with it what sounded like a woman's high, desperate scream. Tam shivered, his spine tensing. Was it a scream or the howling wind? He was just about to convince himself it was only the wind when he heard it again, a high, desperate shriek. Then silence for a moment, then a scream again, louder, higher, more desperate, and it sounded like she was screaming his name. Tam shouted back, "Nellie! Nellie, is that you?" Nellie was Tam's sweetheart. Every week he was sent to collect the films from St. George's Cross by Mr. Pickard, his employer, and every week Tam and Nellie would meet briefly in the street. They had kissed, arranged to meet the following night in town, then Nellie had returned to her work, while Tam continued on his errand. They had only parted a few minutes ago. What could have happened in a few short minutes? "Nellie!" he shouted. A man's voice carried back to him on the wind, shouting one single terrifying word. "Murder!" Tam hefted the sack of film canisters he was carrying further up onto his shoulder, turned on his heel and jogged in the direction of the cry, the film canisters clanking noisily as he ran. As he turned up a dark lane, a cloaked figure came hurtling towards him. They ran straight into each other. The two fell in a tangle, and in the glow of the moonlight through the parting clouds, Tam saw his assailant's blood-smeared face, a face he recognised. "You!" he uttered in surprise. This was the last person he expected to meet in a dark alley. Tam struggled to his feet, but the bloody cloaked figure had already jumped up and now swung a stick at Tam, hitting him hard enough across the back of the shoulders to knock him back down to the cold, wet cobbles. A set of running footsteps approached, and through his confusion and pain, Tam heard an unfamiliar voice with a strange accent say, "Give me the brooch." Tam's assailant seemed to freeze at the sound of the voice and turned to look at the speaker. "What are you doing here? I told you I'd come and see you later this evening. If someone sees us together..." Tam's attacker spat angrily. The man with the accent laughed. "I have an airtight alibi. Take my word for it. Now, give me the brooch." the man demanded, and grabbed the cloaked figure's arm, holding it away while he dipped inside their pocket and pulled out an enormous diamond brooch. Tam had seen it before. Miss Gilchrist always wore it. She said it was a family heirloom, a bit of Victorian paste of no real value. Why would anybody want to murder her for that? Tam was suddenly, for a moment, forgotten, and even though his shoulders were on fire with pain where the stick had hit him, his fear and strong sense of self-preservation forced his body into action. He stretched out his arm, reached for the canvas sack he had been carrying, grabbed it and swung it as he sprang to his feet, striking a lucky nose-breaking blow at one of them. Tam didn't see which. He was already running. He ran as fast as he could up the dark, narrow lane, burst out onto the gaslit street beyond, and kept on running. He wasn't sure if he was being chased, and he didn't dare stop to look behind him. He strained to hear their footsteps pounding the pavement. Instead, all he heard was the clanking of the film canisters in the sack slung over his shoulder. He ran towards the subway station just ahead, clattered through the doors, threw a penny at the girl in the ticket office, and danced impatiently from foot to foot as he waited for her to pass him his ticket, which he grabbed, then dashed on through the turnstile. He raced down the steps and onto the empty underground platform, panic tightening his chest. If they chased him down here, there was nowhere else to run and no one to help him. Then a rush of stale air from the tunnel told Tam that the train was coming. He glanced back towards the steps. There was no sign of his pursuers. A moment later, the train noisily emerged. Out of breath, with his heart practically pounding out of his chest and looking like the devil was on his heel, he pushed open the first carriage's iron lattice gate and jumped on, pulling the gate closed behind him. The electric-lit carriage was a bright contrast to the cold darkness of the gas-lit streets above, and as the underground train slowly jerked into action and trundled into the tunnel, Tam slumped onto a bench, every muscle in his body suddenly quivering like jelly. The train carriage was furnished with 2 long wooden benches that ran the whole length on either side. Tam shared his bench with a young couple who sat cuddled together at the far end, too caught up in each other to notice the new passenger. An older couple sat primly in the middle of the bench opposite. The woman stared suspiciously at Tam, who was still clutching the sack of films as if his life depended on them. He realised he probably looked like a fleeing burglar gripping a bag of stolen swag or something equally suspicious. Well, she could think what she liked. Tam stared straight ahead at the window, which stared back with his own pale, dishevelled image. The image of a wet, cold, bedraggled and scared boy. He certainly wasn't the brave hero he had always imagined himself to be if ever he was tested. When his Nellie had needed him, he had turned and run. But it couldn't have been Nellie that had been murdered. They had old Miss Gilchrist's brooch. Nellie was Miss Gilchrist's maid. She had been out buying the old lady's evening paper when they had met briefly 15 minutes earlier. Had Nellie returned from her errand to discover the old lady's murdered body? Is that why she had screamed? He silently prayed that she was all right. When he got back to work, he would go to Mr. Pickard's office and ask him to telephone the police. Tam worked at the Panopticon, a music hall and funhouse on the Trongate in Glasgow, which boasted everything from variety acts and the latest moving pictures to an attic carnival and basement zoo. He didn't have any specific duties. He'd only started working there a few months earlier, but it was his dream to become a moving picture projectionist. Tam loved the flickers, and Mr. Pickard, the manager, had promised him that he would eventually be trained to use the cinematograph projector. First, however, he had to serve his time as a general hand, doing whatever needed to be done, from picking up the films from St. George's Cross to sweeping up manure in the basement zoo. But tonight, Mr. Pickard was putting him in charge of the magic lantern, an old-fashioned glass slide projector which Tam and old Mr. Hill, the Panopticon handyman, had recently converted to electricity. It was a metal box with a brass-encased lens jutting out from the front. It looked like the prehistoric ancestor of the modern cinematograph, and tonight Tam's job was to use it to project advertising slides between some of the variety acts. He would have to make sure that each slide was clearly in focus on the screen and that they would be shown the right way round. It wasn't exactly the flickers, but it was a damn sight closer than mucking out the monkey house. By the time he got back to the Tron Gate, the front doors of the Panopticon were already open and the crowd was pouring in for the 7:30 p.m. show. Tam could see a small gang of boys pushing their way through, his brother, wee Bobby, carried along in the torrent with them. But he couldn't see his other brother, Jamie, though he was sure he wouldn't be far behind. The force of the crowd was too strong a tide for Tam to fight through, especially with the bulky sack of film canisters, so he made his way up a dirty manure-strewn alley to the stage door. He thumped at the door with his fist, and a grumbling man in a flat cap with the stub of a cigarette poking through his ginger moustache opened it. "You're late," he growled. Tam ignored him and sprinted up the back stairs, the canister clanking and battering against his back, shoved open the heavy door at the top and entered the clamour beyond. The stalls were a riot of noise as people battled for space on one of the hard wooden benches or fought for a good spot to stand at the sides and back. He forced his way through the throng to the doors at the back of the stalls, which people were still flooding through. He pushed his way against the tide and out into the foyer, turned right, and slowly made his way with the rest of the jostling crowd up the stairs to the balcony and projection room, where he dropped off the sack of films with Mr. Richards, the projectionist. Then he pushed his way back down to the stall's foyer and Mr. Pickard's office. He knocked on the door and waited, listening for signs of life. No one answered. He knocked again. "He's gone out," said a voice at his shoulder. It was George Saprini, the stage manager. "What's happened to you?" he asked as he eyed the boy's more dishevelled than normal appearance. Look, I think there's been a murder. I need to telephone the police. Mrs. Saprini, please let me into Mr. Pickard's office." "Not a chance of it." "But it's important. I think there really has been a murder, Mrs. Saprini. Old Miss..." "Did you see a body?" "No, but the scream and so you didn't see a body?" "No, sir, but..." "So you haven't actually seen a murder, lad?" "No, but nothing," Mr. Saprini interrupted impatiently as he glimpsed the time on his pocket watch. Everything was running late tonight, and he didn't have time to listen to this lad's fanciful excuses. He was always late, and there was always some dramatic reason why. "Get to your job, lad, or you'll be seeing Mr. Pickard to get the sack." "But Mrs. Saprini," Tam began. But Mrs. Saprini had no time to listen to another word and was already gone, swallowed by the crowd. "Mrs. Saprini, I think an old lady's been murdered. I saw the murderer covered in blood," he called after him, his voice lost in the melee. Tam forced his way through the excited crowd to where the magic lantern stood on a slightly raised platform at the back of the stalls. A group of men in cloth caps and woolen jackets already crammed the platform, puffing away on Woodbine cigarettes. "Gonny move," he shouted at them above the sound of the band, which had suddenly begun to play a rousing and very loud overture. The men moved enough to allow Tam to squeeze past. He got into position behind the magic lantern and began readying it for the first advertisement of the evening. He barely noticed the first two acts as he fiddled with the newly installed electric light bulb, making sure it was in securely and checking the wires were nice and tightly screwed in, desperately trying to forget his recent terrifying escape from his would-be murderers. The third act, a group of high-kicking dancing girls, were just finishing their routine to rousing approval from the audience when Tam finally looked up from his task. As the dancers left the stage in a flurry of colourful petticoats, a screen tumbled into place and Tam switched on the magic lantern. The electric bulb flared brightly into life, cutting a brilliant tunnel of light through the thick, tarry darkness of the smoky auditorium. He peered through the smoke at the screen to make sure the image was in focus. An advertisement for next week's shows was clearly visible, but he didn't really see it. No matter how hard he tried to concentrate, his head pulsated painfully, and all he could see was the blood-smeared face, bloody hands, and murderous looks of his attackers in the lane. His heart beat fast with the memory as he fumbled in the dimness to change the slide. His palms were sweating and he nearly dropped the fragile square. I should just go to the police now, he thought. I should have run straight to them instead of coming back here. He slid the next advertisement into place, a colourful picture of a lady in an apron pointing to a blackboard with the words, "Go early to bed, drink camp when you rise, and you will be healthy, wealthy and wise." After staring at it for a few seconds, he pulled out the advertisement and turned the magic lantern off. As the screen rolled back up and disappeared above the proscenium arch, the next act was introduced, and the audience roared their approval as a funny little chap with rosy nose and cheeks, wearing a ridiculously long kilt and oversized sporran, stepped onto the stage and began a comic routine. Tam scanned the packed, smoky music hall, watching the people laughing and shouting at the comic. Old men bared toothless gums as they cackled. Mothers rocked with laughter, their babies wrapped in woolen shawls. Young men guffawed and their young ladies giggled. His eyes wandered up to the horseshoe-shaped balcony above that swept around the edge of the music hall where, through the smoky tendrils that hung like low cloud, he could just see a gang of boys leaning over the front. He could see his brother Jamie had joined them. A few short years ago, he had been up in the balcony, enjoying the relative freedom of naughty boyhood. Other things occupied him now, though. His gaze returned to the stage. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw them, his attacker and the man with the accent from the lane. The feeling of panic which he had been trying to suppress began to rise again as their faces bobbed amongst the throng. There was menace in their eyes, and it cut through the dimness to hit Tam square in the chest as panic became pure terror. Surely he was safe here among all these people, he reasoned with himself. But the crowd seemed to part for them, and a few moments later they stepped up onto his little platform at the back of the stalls and flanked him. Nothing was said as Tam looked from one to the other, the fear shining in his eyes. Heckling and laughter filled his ears. He cried out for help, but the yell was drowned in the joyous shouts and cheers of 1,000 others. Then he felt a sudden pain in his left side as if someone had punched him. Tam looked down and saw a sharp blade glint and drip with blood. His blood? It must be. His hand found the wound and came up wet. He looked into the faces of his murderers, for he was sure now that he was dying. They were laughing heartily, as if enjoying a joke with him, the cloaked figure casually wiping Tam's blood off the knife with a delicate handkerchief embroidered with the initials A.B. He still couldn't believe that this person whom he had thought to be good and kind could in fact be so deadly. The tears wet his pale cheeks as he felt his life ebb away. Then the world went black.
And that is the perfect stopping point for the first chapter. Wonderful reading, Judith.
I thank you, Michelle.
I have to say, I always enjoy it. I can't wait to hear the second chapter, which you will all get to hear. Remember, from the first part, it will be on the 2nd of December. So,
First Thursday in December. First Thursday of every month, love.
this is so yes, absolutely. I stand corrected, and we're not going to cut this out because I think it would make a perfect blooper. So what I'm going to say is the first Thursday. I had the second stuck because it's releasing on the 2nd. So it will be the first Thursday of every month. So you can listen to the Jasami Bookworm podcast at that point in time. As always, we love to do little shout outs. Judith, who would you like to do your shout out today?
My shout out today is actually to my mum. Yeah, because she loved this. She read this, but she passed away very recently, so she'll be really pleased that we're going to get it published next year.
I think that's the most wonderful shout out because I know she's going to hear it.
Yeah.
So that's the beautiful one. I will do a shout out also. Mine is to our audience, our listeners, thanking you for listening to us and hoping that you will be enjoying each chapter. And don't forget, if you have an idea for a podcast, don't hesitate to let us know. We have our info at JasamiPublishingLimited.com, that's LTD, or just send a message through. Thank you very much for joining us. This is Michelle from Jasami Bookworm Podcast, wishing you all a sunny day.